Thank you all very much. Yes, I'm Aaron Benz, and this is, if anybody knows me on LinkedIn, I always do Bow Tie Tuesdays, so it's an extra special Bow Tie Tuesday. Very happy to be with you all today. Going to go over this 100,000 student space study. This is a really interesting one. I think a lot of people, when you think about space studies, there's lots of qualitative data. There is no qualitative data in this. This is all high velocity quantitative data. And what do I mean by that? Well, as we get into this, one of the things that when people start seeing some of this data that happens is it's kind of a red pill, blue pill experience when you start seeing how students, faculty, staff are actually using your whole campus. And so what do I mean by actually using? Well, what we do at Degree Analytics and what we're kind of really known for is actually taking in the wireless network across campus to understand how people are interacting using space. So if you have any sensors, other things, we do integrate that. But essentially what we're trying to do is actually get a wide area view into how is all of your space used, your classrooms, your buildings, et cetera, and then what might that mean? And so what we're looking at in this study in particular goes actually before the pandemic, where we're looking kind of 2018, 2019, and then comparing how are the same facilities, the same space actually being used in 2022, 2023. And in particular, what we're trying to line up and actually look at is what's changed, right? We had all these things that happened during the pandemic. How is it different now, right? Are the same way as my dining facilities, my residential dorms, are they different? Are they the same? Are there constructs that we created during the pandemic that actually seem to have persisted to now? And then maybe what does that mean for how we actually handle space differently? So just high level, a little bit about the study. About 100,000 students, looks across 10 different universities, some very large universities, some small universities, there's HBCUs, there's PWIs, there's rural, there's urban. So we picked these in particular because it really represented a kind of a high diversity of the different universities that exist that we work with. And then the second kind of caveat that I'll say is a lot of the trends that I'm saying were very much prevalent across all the universities. There's definitely some nuanced difference depending on kind of culture and really just how a university is run. For example, how much universities emphasize hybrid or continue to emphasize hybrid versus saying, hey, we got to be back in campus. So there's definitely nuances on the individual level. I talked a little bit about that, but essentially how is all this data collected? We integrate with Wi-Fi, so there's no additional kind of hardware sensors, things like that that are necessary. It gives you high visibility into your whole campus. We sterilize that data, so we de-identify everybody's involved. So we basically count kind of warm bodies as opposed to known individuals, and then we kind of get to the metrics. So we looked across lots of different types of behaviors, right? And we think of behaviors as really space categories or topologies. So like office space could be one, but we looked from really class attendance to dining time, fitness time, residential, et cetera. We looked at all the different percentiles, how they really broke out. And so here's some of the big takeaways. Academic spaces, right? So all of your classrooms, labs, your academic spaces. We saw a 25% total dip in how much those spaces are actually being used, right? So like in some ways, if you were to look and compare to pre-pandemic numbers, where now we have our population in undergrad is roughly the 2008 levels, the most harsh way to interpret this is we have almost assuredly 25% more space than we need from an academic perspective. Now, what was interesting, at the same time, we saw a 3.5% boost in class attendance. So you go, how is that possible? Well, we integrate with things like WebEx and Zoom and your LMS to understand how are people coming both physically but also virtually. And what we saw is that essentially the increase in accessibility actually mattered, right? So more people are able to join because it's just much more accessible. They're just not joining physically like they were before the pandemic. In a similar way, dining spaces, large reduction in total space or time spent in dining areas. Now, when you double click on this number, one of the interesting things that you'll see is that the total amount of people using dining facilities actually hasn't changed that much. Just the methodology of how you use dining has. Namely, to-go meals, quick meals, or quick eats. Things like that are actually much more prevalent, and it's kind of all these, things that got set during the pandemic that have continued to persist for how people are choosing to dine, eat, and socialize on campus. At the same time, we actually see there's a higher total usage of campus today than it was pre-pandemic. right? So it's not that students aren't coming to campus, they're actually here more. Again, just the ways that they're using it's changing. One of the hallmark spaces on campus, the library, about a 33% total reduction. Now again, this was a really interesting one because when we double clicked and really looked at all the different libraries across all the campuses, the ones that had kind of the biggest social renovations to them, right? Where it's not more of a traditional library, it's much more breakout group rooms, allowing people to come and work together. Those actually saw boosts, which is really reflected in the biggest winner of all the campus space that we see, which is in all the social spaces across campus. So anything from your student unions to outdoor spaces, right? All these new areas that were created where extensions of Wi-Fi went out, maybe there's additional coverings, but allowing people to actually socialize, interact outside, we see across all of our universities had massive upticks in total utilization. Let's talk about registrar data. So one of the really interesting components that I think has just been relied upon forever is how do we look at space utilization from a registrar event booking perspective. Namely, this is the data we want to use for campus master planning and understanding, how much space do we actually have or how should we redo things. And so one of the questions that kept popping up is basically, is it still an accurate representation of how campus is really used? Like, is it something that we can rely upon, given how much a hybrid has actually impacted and changed the way students, faculty, and staff are using their space? Here's what we see, and this is actually a high variability, but we see from all of our campuses, all the scheduled booked rooms, roughly 5 to 30%, depending on how much you flex hybrid versus how much you require in-person attendance, are rooms that according to the registrar is booked, people should be there, and it's sitting empty. This was a shocker for a lot of our campuses. This is that kind of red pill, blue pill. Oh my goodness, we know these things kind of in our gut where we walk around and we see empty classrooms. Maybe we go to the offices and it's like, I know every space is booked, but there's nobody in here. So why do they keep on asking for more space? It seems like we have more space, but we don't have the data to prove it. This has been a big lasting one that we continue to see, and I think has pretty big implications for how we continue to think about our space. We look at buildings all sorts of different ways. This is an interesting breakout of a particular facility where you can kind of see Monday through Sunday, and then the hours of day are at the bottom. Anybody have and so the darkness is basically the utilization rate during those times. Anybody have a guess of what facility this might be? Not a dining hall. This is a library. It's actually a very common behavioral pattern across libraries where you see a lot of activity during the middle of the day, and then there's this kind of unique Sunday afternoon component where people go in and study and I think just get ready for the week. Now, anybody want to guess what the set points for this building are? This is not uncommon. We see this almost everywhere, right? Where kind of there's two set points. It's either occupied or it's unoccupied, where a lot of buildings aren't reflecting how many people are actually there. And in that, kind of going back to the original one, is really the difference. So when we talk about how do we get to sustainability goals, how do we actually help decrease energy on campus, one of the just right off the top easiest ways I think to start applying some real-time utilization data is actually impacting the energy that we're consuming on a building-to-building level. Roughly speaking, we see most buildings spend somewhere between 30 and 50% more energy than that's needed in cooling spaces or heating spaces because they're treating it like it's at 100% capacity, and it's not. This is a graph that we actually broke out kind of all the different, let's say, main space types across campus. And again, you can see that none of these actually reach 100%. So this is looking at the 95th percentile usage across kind of all the spaces within that category. So you can see during the day, right, academic, and we separated here academic from some classroom facilities, but they start peaking around your normal kind of 10 to 2 hours. You see right in the middle of the screen, there's some dining where you see the peak for lunch, the peak for dinner. But one of the big things I want to point out here when we, again, talk about sustainability and utilization is everything above this line is almost always the energy that you could be saving, especially if all your buildings are being treated at 100%. We have a couple more graph breakouts here. that can be interesting that we tend to look at. So this is, the bigger the square, the more square footage this campus has. The darkness of the square is the highest utilization per square foot hour. And it's a good way to kind of like self-benchmark and look at how your campus is being spent. So like as an example, in the very bottom right, you see dining is the darkest, very typical, right, where we see just a high utilization per square foot. This is a pretty cool chart. We do this for a lot of our campuses. But one of the things that we saw change, and I guess for context, this is actually where we look at where people are coming from and then going to after they visit a facility, right? So because we have Wi-Fi and can see kind of where people are interacting, we can go, well, for the university center, people who came here, where did they come from? When they left, where did they go? And what was interesting about some of our campuses, and there wasn't necessarily a consistent thread, but essentially some of the social hubs on campus had actually changed over time, right? Especially before pandemic to now. And as we think about adding new buildings, different constructs, social groups on campus, it's one of the things that we always look at. So stepping back for a second, right? When I think about just how much stuff has changed, one of the unique ways I think that has been said to me about facilities, which I think is accurate, is facilities' job is to think about the past, present, and future of the university, right? You've got all the deferred maintenance, you got everything that's already been built. You've also have the now, right? We have to clean stuff. We have to manage our current campus, but we also have to plan and understand what the future is gonna look like. Now, I think facilities, in general, doesn't appreciate how much of a vantage point you have for thinking about the full student experience. And so I say this from somebody who spent kind of years on the student success side of the house. We're really looking at touch points, how are we interacting with different students at different times. But facilities is one of the only departments on campus that has a major impact from the prospect stage, right? How do you set foot on campus and begin feeling, is this a place that I want to be at? To the first day you're a student and trying to find that class, trying to find where you go after that class, trying to eat on that, to the time you're an alumni and you're coming back. And one of the things that I think is almost facilities should take more pride in, right? Because we're so used to sitting in the background, is just how much of an impact facilities have on the campus holistically. And in particular, that's kind of where we get to this next piece. So just at a very high level, as students, faculty, and staff are constantly changing the behaviors, I think one of the things that we need to think about or consider is the type of methodologies we use to think about the future of the campus and the ways that we interact. And so in a tech development perspective, we often use these languages, right? These are project management models, waterfall versus agile. Waterfall is like, hey, I want to build a car, you go work on the engine, you work on the tires, you work on the frame, we're going to come together, put everything in, and then we'll have a car. Whereas agile is, well, if we want to build a car, let's like start with a skateboard, right? Just something that moves, and then maybe we add a motor, and eventually we might actually end up with an airplane, right? Something different than we actually intended, but it's how do we iterate through these cycles? The ways students, faculty, and staff are using our campus are now much less predictable than they have been before, which I think means the principles of how we think about the campus are the same, but the process that we ought to apply is different. And so whether that's campus master planning, where in some sense, campus master planning is trying to understand how is our space currently used, right? And looking back, but also visioning in the future. Does it make sense anymore that we do this every 7 years, we get a document, that document starts immediately decaying, and then 7 more years, we look back and say, did that work? And let's plan out the next 7. As opposed to having a methodology that's, well, what are we doing and how are we constantly getting data and feedback and iterating kind of year after year? I think the same thing can be said for custodial and maintenance. I talked with Bill at Minnesota, right? And they have their gold program, which I think is awesome, which is, oh goodness, go out and, help me. Go out looking for dirt, right? Instead of just relying on pure schedules, how can we go and find what needs maintenance now, right? Where is it clean? And how can we use better data to actually prioritize where I know by 2030, 40% of maintenance and custodial staff are set to retire. So that means we have to be a lot smarter about the people that we have and that we're able to train up and use. Department-owned spaces. If you want to look at a good example, I don't know anybody who does that better than Arizona State, right? And how we actually rethink and reorganize spaces in its entirety. Class and office scheduling, and of course, HVAC. right? All of the same principles, I think, for how we need to apply to our space, but how does our process change given the velocity that students, faculty, and staff are using campus differently. Lots of case studies, but I think I'm kind of getting close to the end of time. Again, the Bowtie Tuesday, if you like these kind of data points, things, I like to highlight it online. Would love to have you, get you a bow tie, get you in the spirit of using data and thinking smarter about the future of campus. So thank you all very much, appreciate it.
Sweet.